But I was at a football game on Saturday in Colorado with my sons, Gavin and Gray, and they're in college now at the University of Colorado. They're sophomores. And if any of you are fans of American football, there's been a lot of hype in Colorado around Coach Prime. And it was a very exciting game, and with 4 minutes to go, Colorado scored the go-ahead touchdown. We were up 28-24 against Kansas State. And I was like, me and the whole stadium, 53,000 people were all screaming their heads off, thinking we were going to win. And then sadly turned into a very vulnerable moment where Kansas State, I think, drove down and 84 yards in 3 plays, scored a touchdown. And we wound up losing 31-28. So that was painful, emotionally. And it also hurt my voice. So that's why I'm a bit hoarse today. But wonderful to be here with you. And I do love coming to SaaStock every year because I've made so many friends here in this ecosystem, including Stephen. And I do love meeting fellow SaaS leaders, SaaS entrepreneurs, because I have spent 25 years of my life now building in this industry. And when Alex Thuma, the founder of SaaStock, asked me to speak about sharing your weaknesses and how it can elevate your leadership, I was happy to do it, because I do think, especially in a tougher market now, I think it's probably relevant for a lot of us where our weaknesses tend to get exposed. And I also think that's one thing as a leader. And I've also kind of reframed it. I think it's a good thing that you get held to account and you are criticized. And actually, I think that's a good thing. But it's still oftentimes emotionally hard when you get a 1-star review, let's say on Glassdoor. Generally, I do love reviews, but I've gotten some of those where people rightfully question everything you're doing as an entrepreneur and as a CEO. And I think it kind of hurts, because I know I'm trying to do my well-intentioned best, but I also appreciate that it's not always received that way. When we as leaders make decisions, sometimes decisions that adversely affect people. And so I think one thing I've been learning, I think also sharing your weaknesses, sharing your flaws, and I do have many. 1, I think it makes me feel better, and 2, I think it can help you connect better to your team, your customers, the community. And so it's something that I do like to do, is also share our weaknesses. And sometimes as an entrepreneur, I know I have entrepreneur idols, like Mark Benioff, the founder, CEO of Salesforce. And I got to know him a little bit. My last startup, SteelBrick, was acquired by Salesforce. And I think Mark Benioff, if any of you have seen him at Dreamforce or met him, he is a larger-than-life figure. I think he's like 6'6", huge physical man, and also just a huge presence in the world and our industry. And sometimes I think I look up to entrepreneurs like that, and I'm like, wow, they're perfect. They have no weaknesses. How can I be like them? And it feels quite intimidating. But then one thing I remember when I was at Salesforce, there was a media event. This was in 2016, I think February 2016. They were doing a media event both around like the fiscal year kickoff for Salesforce, but they also announced the acquisition of SteelBrick, and I was there with Mark. And he did an amazing job. But afterwards, I said a quick aside with him, and I could tell, wow, he's still actually kind of nervous about this. And but for me, that was like very humanizing to also see, wow, like an entrepreneur idol, a leader of mine, still gets nervous, even when he seems perfectly polished. And a little bit more about myself. I do love coming to SaaStock and the greater Europe, if you will, now Europe and UK. But I was born in Germany, in Mönchengladbach, small industrial town in the northwest. You might have heard of it if you follow European football, Borussia Mönchengladbach. And the year I was born in 1971, they actually won the Bundesliga championship. But they haven't won since the 70s, so it's been a while. And then I moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania when I was 10 years old with my father and my mom. And my father was also an entrepreneur. He was in pump manufacturing. And I think I've learned a lot from my father, including he was a big risk taker because he was it was a small family pump manufacturing company, but he was trying to start a subsidiary in the US, trying to do it remotely, it wasn't working. So he decided to pick up the family and move us all over there. And so then I grew up in Pittsburgh, also became a fan of American football, the Pittsburgh Steelers. Luckily, they won on Sunday. unlike the Buffs. And so that's where I grew up. And then I went to study at MIT. And this was also inspired by my father because I think he wanted me to go in the pump manufacturing business. And I think I decided that if I was going to do that, I didn't want anyone to say it was nepotism, so I was going to get as well prepared as possible. So he said, you have to go study mechanical engineering. So I did that at MIT. I got a bachelor's and a master's in mechanical engineering. During that time, I did also start getting into software. I remember I wrote a C simulation software of a manufacturing process. And so also started to fall in love with software and tech while I was at MIT. And I remember I thought about starting our first company, even coming out of MIT, with my best friend. Later, we started Big Machines, but we were actually almost started the company in 3D printing in 1994. In hindsight, I'm glad we didn't do that, because I think 3D printing is still like a trend, and we probably would have been a few years too early. So I worked as a consultant. Then I went to business school at Stanford in the late 90s, and that's when I started getting into tech. I started helping 2 computer science students at Stanford, and I say too bad it wasn't Larry and Sergey. They were at Google at the time, starting Google at the time at Stanford, but I helped 2 other entrepreneurs. They were starting a business software company, and that's how I got into this industry. And then about a year later, in 2000, I decided to start our own company, Big Machines. And this was inspired by my father, whom I mentioned, but I wanted to help him sell his pumps online. And he was still in Pittsburgh at the time. I'd moved out to the Silicon Valley. And I remember I went back to Pittsburgh for Thanksgiving, November 99. I was asking my father, how's the internet going to affect your industry? And to my surprise, he just said, it's not. And I was like, what do you mean, Dad? I was coming from what they call the reality distortion zone of the Silicon Valley. And even in 1999, obviously Jeff Bezos had launched Amazon. Everyone was already afraid of getting Amazoned. I think that's still true 25 years later. But at the time, they were only selling books online. And I think what my father explained to me, look, my pumps, they aren't like a book. It's not a simple SKU you can just order online and buy, but I sell very engineered products, very engineered pumps. And every time a customer wants a quote, we have to custom configure the pump based on the pressure, the flow rate, the viscosity, and create a custom proposal for them. And there's no way you can do that online. But then I saw what Michael Dell was doing with Dell. And he was one of the, obviously he's still a great entrepreneur today, but he was one of also the internet darlings. And he was the first one to sell customizable PCs online. And he did that with online configurators where you could choose your memory, your hard drive, your screen size, like a 14-inch latitude, your operating system, and about 20 choices. And then behind the scenes, it would, 1, make sure you had a valid configuration, 2, tell your pricing, your lead time, and you could just buy it online. And that was kind of what we decided to do with Big Machines, to go, help him do the same with his pumps. But he only had 2 IT people at his company, and they didn't know even how to host a website in 1999. And so we also decided to build it as today what you'd call SaaS, where we said, wow, they don't have to install their own web server. We'll host everything for them. We'll just give them a login, and his pump engineers can upload their products, their rules, their pricing, and they'll be able to start selling. So that's a basic idea. And that's when we set off. And eventually that company was successful, but I'll talk more about that. Was only after many years of struggle. Then we built another one of those after Oracle acquired Big Machines, SteelBrick, CPQ software for Salesforce ecosystem. Today it's the Salesforce Revenue Cloud. And then G2 we started in parallel to SteelBrick, but really inspired by our challenges at Big Machines, which included, I think it took us 9 years to get in Gartner report, 12 years to become a leader, and so we thought there must be a better way. And so G2, the idea was let's create a consumer, more Amazon-like shopping experience with online reviews, peer reviews for software. And that's still my day job. And when I'm not doing that, I do like helping other entrepreneur friends now build their own companies. And while I think Big Machines ultimately succeeded, I did have a lot of, frankly, constant fear of failure, anxiety, fear, uncertainty, and doubt as I was building my first company, Big Machines. And now, and there's also, I think this is more well-known today. There's research. Obviously, it's hard to build a SaaS company. You all know that. You're all involved in building SaaS companies. And also, I think, over 50% of founders are likely to suffer from anxiety, depression, and even substance abuse. And I felt that storm cloud in my head as I was building my first company. because we had this glorious vision that I just described, selling those pumps like Dell PCs, and at the beginning it was kind of euphoric. It was a dot-com boom, so we were actually able to raise like $20 million the first year, basically just having a cool internet vision. And frankly, at that time, VCs were also, I was 28 years old, and hindsight, I was clueless, but the internet was brand new, so VCs were willing to give money to young, clueless entrepreneurs like myself. So the first year was really fun and euphoric. We scaled up to 70 people. I remember we incorporated on January 1, 2000, because we said we're going to be the company for the new millennium. So not very humble. But then we quickly got humbled, because about a year later, the dot-com boom turned to a dot-com bust. And then I remember I said, oh, now I'm going to go raise my next round. And all of a sudden, the same VCs that were clamoring to back young, clueless people with no revenue, they quickly wisened up. And even Amazon, I remember in 2001, Wall Street was writing credit risk reports on Amazon. Everyone was betting, when's Amazon going to go bankrupt? And also a lot of our prospective customers, these manufacturers, we'd go call on them in 2001. They'd kind of politely listen. At the end of it, they were like, well, the internet was a fad. The internet's over. We're happy sending product information on CD-ROMs and paper catalog to our distributor and customers. So, one, we don't need your product, and two, you're going bankrupt because you're one of those wacky dot-coms. So it got really hard. And I do remember every day I felt like I was failing. And I'd recruited my best friends from MIT to join me at the company. And I remember starting to think, wow, I'm ruining their careers, ruining my career. My father, I also convinced him to be our first customer, our first investor. So I'm like, wow, I'm going to lose my dad's money, ruin my career, ruin my friends' careers. And so it felt very heavy. And frankly, during that time, I also had all this storm cloud, and sometimes I deal with it by drinking too much, eating too much. I think I was about, 40 pounds heavier, because I was stuffing my anxiety with too much food, too much alcohol, and I just didn't know how to deal with the stress. So it felt very heavy. And we also had to let go of, to survive, we realized at some point we're never going to be able to raise more money, so we had $1 million left in 2003. Of the 20 million, we'd burned 19 million. We were only doing about $1 million a year in revenue, so our numbers were terrible. I think we missed our sales plan by 90% in 2001 and 2002 and in 2003. So needless to say, no investor was going to give us more money. And so we also made a difficult decision. Over a couple of rounds, we let go 50 of 70 people. A lot of them were good people. So that felt horrible. And but my co-founder, Chris, and I, we did decide we were going to persevere. And at the time, we didn't know it was rational, but I think, one, we didn't want to quit on each other. We were best friends, back to freshman year from MIT. We didn't want to quit on each other. And secondly, we did have about a dozen early customers that were starting to have success with using our online, at the time, it started to become CPQ software, but they were using our online quoting and ordering, and it was about 80% more efficient than fax and offline processes. So we thought eventually it'll catch on if we can survive. So we let all those people go. But then I remember for about a year, it felt like it was getting worse. My wife and I, we'd gotten married in 2002, and then we decided to have kids. And, but I remember the first big surprise when my wife and I were trying to get pregnant. I remember she took a home pregnancy test, it was positive, and then she's going to the doctor that day, and she's calling me. And I didn't pick up because I'm like in a customer meeting, and I'm like, oh, I know, she's just confirming she's pregnant. And I call her back after the meeting, she's like, there's 2 heartbeats. I'm like, what's that mean? Like, something wrong with the kid? And like, we're having twins. So that was a shock. And then, also, I didn't realize this, but now I know, but like twin pregnancies also tend to be more high risk. So I also remember like at 27 weeks of her pregnancy, all of a sudden, she went to the doctor and she had to go on bed rest. And then she had to be in the hospital for 4 weeks because it was obviously way too early. And we wound up, our twins were born 30 weeks and 5 days. So it was, which obviously was super scary. And like I said, I always thought when you have a baby, everything's normal, right? I never expected that something like that would happen or it could happen. But I remember they were in the neonatal intensive care for a few weeks. But I remember like my lowest point felt like, we were also trying to save big machines. So while they were in the neonatal intensive care, I drove up to see a prospect. At the time we were in Chicago, drove up to Wisconsin to see SPX, and it was going to be our biggest deal, $250,000 deal. At that point, we were living off customer revenue, so it was going to fund us for another quarter. And I remember we showed up at the front desk to see the president of this business unit, who we thought was about ready to sign our contract. We show up at the front desk, and I'm like, here we see Don Canterna. And the receptionist's like, oh, Don's not here today. We're like, that's funny, we have an appointment. Like, sorry, Don's not here. He didn't bother telling us. And so then I had about an hour and a half drive back to Chicago. And I remember during that drive, I'm like, wow, my life can't get any worse. You know, my company's failing. Our boys are in the neonatal intensive care. I was feeling horrible. And but then as I got to the hospital, I don't know, somehow I shifted to acceptance. I'm like, my life can't get any worse. But then once I said that, somehow maybe something lifted. And then from there, I feel like that was a low point in my life, mentally, emotionally, physically, business-wise. And then luckily from there, everything only got better. And our boys now, like I mentioned, they're at the University of Colorado. They're doing great. Sophomores studying business, really enjoying life. So they came home out of the hospital and have become amazing kids. And then also the company, we did persevere. And then I think 2007, we finally really found product market fit because we decided to partner with Salesforce as well as with Oracle CRM On Demand. And then as those CRM systems, the cloud CRM systems moved up market, all of a sudden they needed a partner for CPQ, and we were already there. And then we actually had a great run with positive cash flow all the way until Oracle bought the company. And then those years were more fun from a business standpoint. Although I remember that whole journey, I had that constant anxiety, fear, and doubt. And then we did do a second company after Big Machines, and that one felt it was a lot easier because we built, I think the one thing we did, we built tremendous bonds, and so we brought over 100 people from out of Oracle into Big Machines, and we were able to very quickly build a winner that Salesforce acquired. But I think it was only because of all the hard lessons we learned the first time. And then we started G2 in parallel, actually a little bit before SteelBrick, but it was going super slow. And there on that chart, you can see our revenue. We were pegged solidly at zero. This is only thousands of dollars. And I think by the end of that second year, 2013, we were doing like 20,000, quarter in revenue, so almost nothing. So I also kind of thought, wow, this is too hard. I need to go build something else. And so I turned the baton over to Tim, my co-founder. He was our product co-founder. And then he did a great job figuring it out. But I also think I realized as a leader, I wasn't the right leader because at Big Machines, I'd become more of a go-to-market revenue leader. And G2 really needed more time just to incubate the product, to get the reviews, the buyer traffic, to get the relevance. And I turned the baton over to Tim. And frankly, he did a much better job getting the company to product market fit. And then I came back a few years later after SteelBrick and Salesforce to help them scale it once we got the revenue scale. But I also say that wasn't my strength, was to kind of organically bootstrap the company, and Tim did that much better than I did. So sometimes also as a leader, it's like realizing what you're good at. And G2 was actually too early for me, so I left and came back later. And then G2 did really start growing, but in terms of vulnerability, this was also hard. Where Business Insider wrote this story because we had raised $100 million. The company was having success, but then I remember early in 2020, all of a sudden we realized we'd overdone it. We scaled very quickly after I came back from like 100 to 400 people, built this amazing, beautiful new office. And then also COVID started happening. But this was right before COVID. We actually realized, wow, we had to let some of our team go. And then our HR team had to walk them up these beautiful stairs. And we let them go, some of them, because we had to adapt our cost structure, and it made sense for the business. But obviously, those people felt horrible. And some of them talked to a Business Insider reporter who's like, how could you build this $1 million staircase and then open the office, next day lay people off? And at the beginning of the COVID, we were also kind of panicked about the world ending, and our investors were panicked. So we did also apply for a PPP loan. We never took it. But Business Insiders decided to turn this all into a story. Like, look at this dumb founder, raises all this money, blows it, puts it all in a fancy office, and then lays people off and tries to get a loan from the government. So needless to say, it was not flattering. And those moments are tough. But like I said, and I think I also read this about Jeff Bezos, the Amazon founder, and he's also had some bad public moments, but he also says, as a leader, it's part of the job, right? You deserve to be criticized because, and this is also true of government leaders, right? Because we control a lot of resources, so when we're not doing our job well, we actually deserve the criticism. Although it's hard to take, but I kind of reframed it that way. And then somebody also said, hey, until you have a hit piece in Business Insider, you're not really anybody. So thank you, Business Insider. And then we did face reality, and then a year later, actually those changes we made, including layoff, looked really smart. And I think we were lucky as an industry because, about a quarter into COVID, most of us, by like June 2020, all of a sudden, wow, there's actually increased demand for digital. And I remember also video conferencing. The traffic in that category surged like 400% in March 2020 because all of a sudden everyone needs an app like Zoom. And the Zoom founder, Eric Yuan, also became a customer, but he always loved G2 because it helped him prove that he was, at least had much higher customer sat than, let's say, Teams. And so obviously that validation helped Zoom really grow, and then our business also really grew. And actually about a year later, we became a unicorn, and then all of a sudden we got positive press again. All of a sudden, at least according to this report, all of a sudden we were genius entrepreneurs again. Although, I feel like the same, right, in both moments. I think I was the same person, but obviously you're going to be perceived in very different ways when you're winning versus when you're losing. And then after that high, I think we all had that high in 2021, right? Then all of a sudden, I remember in May 2022, all of a sudden our pipeline melted down. I think we'd hit plan like 8 or 9 quarters in a row. Everything was going great. And all of a sudden, at the end of May 2022, all these deals we forecast to close all of a sudden pushed. Like, what's happening? Actually, we didn't change anything, right? But all these marketing, we're typically selling, let's say, directors of marketing, they're telling our sales team, oh, I'm going to buy this month. And I think they thought they were. But then by the end of that May, all of a sudden, CFOs, and now I have a great CFO, Chad, but all of a sudden, they started looking at every bit of spend in every company and all of a sudden started saying no. So our business all of a sudden slowed down dramatically. And obviously, here's a graph of US venture funding. We've all seen that, right, where SaaS in 2021, everyone seemed like everyone was becoming a unicorn, everyone was raising hundreds of millions, to all of a sudden, it pretty much stopped. Unless you're an AI genius, which I'm not, unless you're Sam Altman, all of a sudden it got really hard to raise money. And so we actually had to slow down again. And again, probably got some deserved criticism, right? Because we kind of assumed, like a lot of people, wow, we're going to be on this growth trajectory forever, and then we weren't. And also had to rebuild our leadership team and introduce a lot more focus. And one of the more painful decisions, again, as an entrepreneur, in 2019, when we were raising all this money, we also acquired a startup called Siftery. We're going to also build a track product. So we're not only going to serve tech CMOs, CROs, but we're also going to serve CIOs with this amazing track solution, help them manage all their SaaS spend. And then I think this was in 2022. This was a real leadership meeting. Maybe it was last year where that was me laying on the floor on my face because I kind of had to admit to my team, wow, that was a big mistake, or we can't make this happen at the same time. So we decided to spin it off to Better Cloud so we could just focus on the G2 marketplace. But that was another very humbling moment. And I do think in entrepreneurship I found it's kind of this constant up and down. Between one moment you're euphoric, you're a unicorn builder, you're a genius, and then the next moment you're like an idiot that overexpanded, overinvested, and has to stop doing something. And so, what have I learned through all this? I do think you have to embrace the ups and downs, and here's just some of the ones we've seen at G2. But also keep the vision, and right now I'm very excited, probably like most of you. I think AI, we've launched an AI Monty. I do think it's actually going to help us accelerate bringing our vision to life of building the trusted place to go for software. Because all of a sudden now with ChatGPT, with AI, we can be the ultimate software matchmaker. And so while I realize there'll probably be some more, at the moment I kind of feel like we've gone through our most recent down. Now we're pretty efficient, free cash flow positive, still growing, not as fast as we'd like, but I'm optimistic that, with AI, our whole industry and G2 can re-accelerate to more growth over the next couple of years. And for me, it has taken a ton of perseverance. Like I said, my first company, Big Machines, took 7 years till we really had a good business, till we really found product market fit. And eventually it did lead to a $400 million exit, but it wasn't without 7 years of what to me felt like intense suffering. And then when we started G2, we were also more thoughtful about that. How do we define a culture that can persevere, good times and bad times? And we decided, we were inspired by Chip Conley, who later became the head of hospitality for Airbnb. Before that, he'd built a hotel chain, Joie Vivre, a very successful entrepreneur in his own right. And he was also very philosophical. And I met him at a Stanford entrepreneur alumni reunion, and he'd written this book that we thought really inspired us. He talked about how great companies get their mojo from Maslow and how you can very consciously shape a culture that can persevere and where your employees are truly inspired. And so we decided to take peak as our cultural mantra, and we turned it into our mnemonic for our values of performance, entrepreneurship, authenticity, and kindness. And sometimes the kindness seems in juxtaposition, but I do believe even when you're letting people go, you can be kind. And so we aim to balance that. We want to be very high performing, very entrepreneurial, very innovative, but even when we're making hard decisions, we can still do it in a kind and an authentic way. And I think the only way I've been able to persevere, and I'm still doing this 25 years later, and sometimes people ask me, because you've had 2 good exits, why are you still doing this? And I kind of realized after my first company, and I had about a year off, I just kind of realized I really missed it. And I went back to it, I'm like, hey, I'm choosing this, I'm choosing the roller coaster ride. But also, I would only do it those are my co-founders for G2, but every company I've had co-founders, because I found those really dark days. I find having co-founders is what can keep me going. And then obviously, eventually your co-founders also, your team tends to involve, but having a tight bond with your leadership team, and of course my family. And there's our twin boys, now sophomores. Our daughter's a senior in high school. And my amazing wife, Stacy, she's stayed with me through all the ups and downs. And I think that's kind of what's kept me growing and grounded. And I also learned towards the end of my Big Machines journey that there was a better way to deal with this storm cloud of anxiety. And it's conscious leadership. And I met Jim Dethmer. He became my coach. He's now a conscious leadership guru. He has a great website called conscious.is. And I've also kind of now believe that entrepreneurship, business leadership can actually be a path to enlightenment, if you will. And but he has defined 15 principles that I'm always working on, and I still work with a coach. But shifting to more of an above-the-line mindset, and part of it to me is that everything is a choice. I'm choosing to be an entrepreneur. So even if I'm delayed, stuck in Heathrow for 10 hours, which happens, and sometimes you're like, why the hell am I doing this? Why am I not home with my family? But then you remember, 1, I chose this, and 2, you kind of remember your greater purpose and vision. And then you can reframe it like, no, I'm choosing to be here. And I can still enjoy it, even when it seems to suck. And I've also learned to take better care of myself, and now I do work out every day. I block an hour in my calendar. I call it peak physical, spiritual, mental time. And I'll go outdoor run, bike ride, now living in Colorado, climb up a snowy peak in the winter. And I've also become a fan of Sadhguru, who wrote a great book called Inner Engineering, which, basically, and I believe this now, that you really engineer yourself for happiness. And I think we also often think like, oh, I'm not happy because I'm not hitting my goals at work. And I think what I kind of believe now, that's not really true, right? It's more how you take care of yourself mentally, spiritually, physically, that puts you in a place to be happy or not, regardless of the results. So thank you all for being with me here at SaaStock. And yes, if you want to connect, I'm on LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. My email is Godard@G2, and I'll be around here. We have a G2 booth, so if you want to come by and say hello. But thank you all, and hope you enjoy the rest of SaaStock.